Industries that are hot, sectors set to outperform the market. That's what's here in Zacks Industry Rank Analysis.
Charles Rotblatt, you know him, senior market analyst at Zacks.com. He puts this report all together for us each week. He's joining me once again to talk about a couple of interesting sectors here, biotech and generic drugs on your radar screen for this week. Now, I do know from having been to the pharmacy lately that a lot of drugs that are coming off patent now, so there are more of the popular drugs, or I should say the better selling drugs, the more prescribed drugs, becoming available in generic form. That's a good thing.
It is, and when we look here, I'm really specifically looking at the biotechs and generic drug makers as opposed to large cap pharma, which we have talked about recently. Mm-hmm. And this really holds true for a lot of companies in the broader medical sector, focusing here on two specific groups this week. But it's an industry that's really less economically sensitive, and that's benefiting their earnings. Wouldn't say that they're completely not economically sensitive. Certainly, at the fringes, we are seeing some people hold off on their medications. Certainly, as you said, the trend towards generics is helping certain people, and certainly generic drug makers. We're seeing Walmart with $4 prescriptions.
And those are mostly generic form.
Right, generic form. Walgreens has some new plan out where you have to pay a certain amount to join, and then you get discount medication.
Right.
But what we're seeing overall in the medical sectors, we are seeing positive earnings, bullish guidance, raised consensus estimates by the analysts. And this is, again, it's a sector if somebody wants to look in for companies that are doing well right now in the current economy. It's certainly an area they can look to. And the nice thing about biotech is if someone wants to be more aggressive, want to look for stocks that might actually rise considerably to the upside as opposed to maybe make measured gains to the upside, it's certainly an area to look. One thing I do note in here, though, particularly with the biotechs, a lot of the stock price not only depends on analyst estimates, but also depends on what's in their pipeline, how the phase 2, phase 3 trials go, what the FDA says, and obviously safety. So there are factors beyond the earnings estimates. But certainly when you look at those companies, if you look at the trends in earnings estimates, that's an early sign as to what analysts are going to expect. And certainly once they have a drug on the market, then it really comes down to how well is the drug selling. And if you're a biotech company, particularly a small one, with only one or two drugs on the market, then the consensus earnings estimates really matter because it really depends on whether or not your drug is really gaining the favor among doctors and gaining the prescription momentum needed to propel revenues and earnings higher.
I would think that now more than ever, what's in the pipeline is extremely critical to these companies, because this is what's going to account for their sustainability going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly with the biotech companies, what's in the pipeline really what makes or breaks them. A lot of times, especially the small companies, they only have a few drugs that really drive their revenue, sometimes only one or two, and so it's a key thing. One of the companies, for instance, I talk about this week is Alpharma. They've got a drug actually that's being reviewed by an FDA advisory committee. It's meeting this Friday, November 14th. Although I don't think the expectations is that the drug will be approved or recommended for, it might be recommended for approval at that point. More importantly, we might get some information about the drug's safety, about how well it's performed in phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials is really where they actually give the drugs out to a larger test group of humans to see whether or not there's any adverse effects. Obviously, if the safety data comes back favorable, that could give a boost to the company. I should also point out that companies actually there's an offer on the table by King Pharmaceuticals to acquire the company for cash. It's turning into a hostile takeover. The board's already rejected the claim. As with any merger scenario, always difficult to say how it's going to play out, but there are factors outside the merger that could cause the stock price to go higher, particularly bullish earnings, raise consensus estimates, and obviously we'll have to see what happens on Friday. That could also provide an additional boost to the stock. Similarly, if some bad news comes out of it, it could hurt the stock. So investors should be aware that with some of these companies, there are risks outside the normal framework that we generally evaluate companies by simply because of the type of industry and type of business that they're in.
You bring up an interesting point. M&A activity since this financial crisis erupted has been down pretty significantly. But is this one area where we still may see some of that here going forward into the new year?
You know, possibly. I think especially when you look at the large pharmaceutical companies, they're flush with cash, and a lot of times their pipelines are questionable. And so certainly if you're a larger cap pharmaceutical company, you may want to look at acquiring. Similarly, what we do see a lot, though, is a large cap pharmaceutical company actually partnering with a small biotech. The advantage for them is all the payments that are based on milestone. If the drug gets approved, if it gets through phase 3 trials successfully, if it reaches a certain benchmark in terms of sales, the upshot of your large cap pharmaceutical company is you get a share of the revenues. Often you might have sales rights, say, internationally, which helps improve your bottom line, but you don't have the risk of actually buying another company. And certainly, you also are not taking as much developmental risk as you would if you were trying to develop a drug inside your own pipeline, simply because all your payments are based on the biotech or the smaller company actually reaching a certain milestone in the drug's progress, whether it has to do with the trials or whether it has to do with sales.
You mentioned a couple of other stocks in your piece this week. I don't want to give it away because I want people to go to the text piece on Zacks.com and look up those names. I'm going to put you on the spot because I haven't done this in a while with you. What are the top 2 or 3 industries that are on your radar here going forward into year's end?
Certainly medical. We're continuing to look at defense, and I should specify defense, not aerospace, because certainly there's some questions about the commercial aerospace sector. Boeing in particular has had some problems. Obviously, they've had a strike that was resolved, but there's questions about spending on the commercial side. But I think really, if you're an investor, you're really looking at more of those conservative things. We are seeing some companies in computer technology with positive estimates. However, it's a broad sector, and I think it's really not so much buy technology, but more so look at the individual companies and see which companies are doing well within that group. So those are the 3. Certainly, we talked about education before. We talked about it last week. And for a lot of investors, it's important to realize that even though the economy is having trouble, there are companies that are doing well. Obviously, on the flip side, I'd continue to avoid financials, continue to avoid retail. Automotive sector, I would not play at all on that possible bailout for GM and Ford. GM and Ford, excuse me. Almost said Forbes, not Steve Forbes.
No.
Steve Forbes, as far as we know, is doing
very
fine.
sound as far as we know.
But with GM and Ford, we'll have to see how this bailout plays out. And it's very important to realize they could get the bailout, and shareholders could still end up with the short end of the stick, simply because the debtors take precedence. And certainly there's an argument to be made that force these companies to go into some type of bankruptcy where they have to go to reorganization. Obviously, that's not good news for the shareholders. Helps the bondholders a little bit more. But the bigger thing is really, how do we save these companies, and how do we protect as many jobs as possible versus what do we do to help protect the shareholders? I think the issues with those companies are, go far beyond the helping the shareholders, and it's really a matter of how do we preserve jobs, because those companies' long-term success really affects more than them, but also all the parts suppliers and all the companies that are related to building and selling cars.
All right, well, Charles tries to help you, those of you who come to Zacks.com regularly, by keeping you well apprised of industries that are set to outperform the market. As we said, the text version of this week's industry rank analysis is available on Zacks.com, linked to right off of our homepage. With Charles Rotblatt, I'm Terry Ruffalo.